learned a lot from John Richardson. I learned a lot from the lawyers who were in his office, Judge Charles Lindsay, Judge Fred Sexton, Judge C.J. Bolin. I learned a lot from the good lawyers in Paul Hermich's office, Howard Fish, Laura Fulco, Suzanne Owen. I learned a lot from my colleague Hugh Thompson and others that now work with us. The only thing I can say to you is, as a candidate for this office, that is all I can offer you, is that experience. And that will either be enough or it won't be enough. But you're not going to see me on TV. You're not going to see me send you a fundraiser, because there aren't going to be any fundraisers. I'm not asking for any money from anybody. And I don't want to owe anybody if I got elected to that position. And when you take money, you take what goes with it. So I ain't taking it. That's all I really have to say to you this morning in terms of formal remarks. I'd be glad to take any questions.
Let me DA talk. You want something to drink with?
No, thank you.
What can I get some? The only one question I have, I didn't know I had questions, but I want you to clarify, I had a meeting with you one-on-one.
Sure.
To clarify what you mean needs to kill more. That's been the buzz in the community.
Did I say that?
I think you did. But anyway, it was a statement made that you did say that.
No,
and I mentioned it to you in the private setting, but kind of clarify in front of the audience, how did that statement come out and what did you mean when you said that?
Oh, sure.
So we can clear the air and go out to the community.
You'll get to see this statement on 60 Minutes. You'll get to read it in the New Yorker, and you'll get to read it in the New York Times. And probably all over the internet and everywhere else. I'm old school, so I wouldn't know how to get on the internet in my life. But I'm told that it's out there.
It is.
The statement I made was in response to a news person's question. It was not a prepared remark, so I'd like to know that. I didn't sit up all night thinking, let me kill more people. And it was a response to a remark Mr. Stroud had made in an open letter he wrote to the Shreveport Times. Thank you. And Mr. Stroud had said that he opposed the death penalty because he thought it was barbaric, and he thought that our system was so effective in and of itself that no legitimate death penalty could ever issue from such a system. And the news reporter asked me what I thought about that article, and I said, well, I disagree with it because I don't think the death penalty is barbaric. I think the way we've structured it in our community, in our state, first of all, it's constitutional, it's the law, it's the people's will, and we have a very structured scheme where we ensure that only the worst of the worst of the worst are eligible for this penalty. So I said, I don't think in and of itself the penalty is barbaric. I think what is barbaric is what the criminals are doing to the children. And I went on to elaborate, as I have with you this morning. I said, I don't think the system is effective. I think the system works as well as any system ever devised. And any system is only as good as the people who run it. And as long as you have good people of integrity and character and competence, you'll have a good system. But I added, and this is where the old lawyer adage, stop while you're ahead, don't ask one question too many. I violated the cardinal rule, and I went on to say, and not only that, but I really think we should kill more people. And what I meant by that was the level of savagery and the level of heinousness I've seen over the course of time. If anything, it merits the employment of the death penalty more often not less of. Now, the second part sounds better than the first part, but as news reporters will do, they only quoted the first part. And so I've been answering the first part for 6 months now. I meant what I said, I just shouldn't have said it that way. And we all know how sometimes when a reporter will stick a microphone in your mouth, you may react without the benefit of clear thought. And so, anyway, that's what I meant, and I do mean that. I think that we have seen so much savage crime that you have to have that death penalty. And I don't think it's a deterrent. I've been asked that, well, do you think it'll deter other people from committing murder? No. The reason is the people who commit first-degree murder are so evil they cannot be deterred. They're not like you and me. They don't react to what you and I react to. Like this man who went into the church in Charleston, South Carolina, I guarantee you he is not deterred by anything because he's, and I don't mean this in a legal sense, legally insane, but he's crazy. And he's filled with hate. And people like that don't get deterred. You can't reach them. Like, I can tell you, if you steal that chair, I'm going to take your house away. So you don't steal the chair. It doesn't work with people who commit first-degree murder. I mean, if you're going to break every bone in a 6-month-old baby's body, it's going to deter you if I tell you to don't do that, because we're going to kill you in 30 years. No. What I do think the death penalty does is and I'm going to use another word now that I should have used a better word for, is revenge. The Supreme Court of the United States says retribution is one of the justifications for the death penalty. That's the United States Supreme Court, not me. And they've said it for 40 years now, since Furman v. Georgia. Retribution is another word for revenge. And what I have said is that our society, our people as a whole, if we're going to be deserving of the name society, if we're going to be deserving of the epitaph that we are a community of honest, decent, social beings who work with and not against each other, we also have a right to be outraged when somebody violates our rules in such an egregious fashion. And by that I mean this. If you go and you break into an 86-year-old man's house and he's crippled and he can't defend himself because he's dying himself, if you break into his house in the middle of the night and you choke him to death, and then you cut off his head, and you cut off his arms, and you cut off his legs, and you, sadist that you are, take him out and bury his head here, and then 2 miles down the road bury his arms, and then toy with the police and say, if you give me a break, I'll tell you where the head is. If you give me another break, I'll tell you where the arms are. When all the while this man's family is grieving and begging that they have a Christian burial where they can put this man's body in the ground in Christ's name and they can have some closure. And this sadist is toying with them. I think society has every right to revenge. And I'm not talking about this man's family. I'm talking about us as a community. Because if we can't have bright red lines that we draw like that, then we might as well turn out the lights and go home. Because we have lost any semblance of a society. We have a right to be outraged when you break our rules this badly. You have forfeited your right to live among us. And I see that as across the board. I don't see that as anything else but a legitimate revenge. You know, the law has evolved, and some people say it's evolved decently, some people say not. But in early England, if somebody came into your house and killed a loved one of yours, the jury would hear your case, and the jury would say, you're guilty. The judge would then turn to your family member, your father, your brother, your uncle, and say, now you kill him the same way he killed your loved one. That's going to be your punishment. See, I think that was a good idea. I know that you can't say that in polite circles now, but or you could be politically incorrect, God forbid. But that is the underlying theology, if you will, of revenge. Is that you've taken something from me, you've taken something so precious from me that I have a right as a society to take your life. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Well, first off, Ms. Scott, thank you for coming. I am a proponent of the death penalty. I work to basically clear up the injustices that help get people prosecuted, because within the construct of the system, that's where your issues are. You mentioned in the Glenn Ford's case, there was some information that came forward. What information was that? And I will say this, racism is real in America. My cousin, Alvin Moore, was the last person electrocuted in the state of Louisiana. He wasn't convicted in Caddo Parish, but Bossier Parish, by an all-white jury for a crime he definitely did not commit. Definitely he committed an ethical crime, sleeping with this dude's wife, and he was the one that murdered the entity. But in 7 years to the date of her murder, he was electrocuted quickly. And I know other people that are on death row that have committed murder. Amanda Birdsong, who was mother and father, principal, educators. So the two-parent household thing, I don't buy that. There's a lot that goes into that overall dynamic, and he's still on death row.
So is Nathaniel Caddo.
Yeah, and so these people should have been killed. But the one that should have been killed, who didn't commit a crime, is now dead. Glenn Ford, 30 years, now dead as a byproduct of spending that time. And to work with somebody like Calvin, who had spent, he wasn't on death row, but here he spends 20-something years in prison for a crime that he didn't commit. And so you have prosecutors who know that there's information that could actually absolve these individuals. So racism is real, and the dynamics of the ethics and integrity of people, but the prosecutors and the police, that's where the game is actually played. So can you speak to the information that you all found? And if you do win this position, how do you now get some cultural sensitivity as it relates to not only prosecutors in your office, but advocating for those police officers that need to do a better job investigating to give the information to effectively prosecute cases?
Okay. Number one, I can't reveal the nature of the new information.
Okay.
And the reason being is twofold. One, there are 2 civil lawsuits now pending that involve that question.
Okay.
But also, the Isidore Roseman homicide is still, for our office, open homicide.
Okay.
And to reveal the nature of that information would be to compromise the integrity of that information. So tell you this about the nature of the information. And Duke will tell you this. It's not uncommon for us as prosecutors, after a conviction of someone, for there to be new information that comes in. That happens all the time. We've even had people come in and confess to the crime. And when we looked in it, we termed it, they were nuts. They were just seeking notoriety. So the fact that there's new information is not necessarily something rare. In fact, it's common. The question is, what is the nature of the new information, and is it credible? We did a lot of cross-checking on this information to make sure it was credible, and it was my judgment that it was. Third thing is, you read a lot and you see a lot about DNA exonerating somebody. Like you'll see a man was in jail for 30 years for a rape, and then it turns out that the DNA proved it couldn't have been him, it had to be somebody else, and he's free from jail. But let me emphasize to you that the Glenford case is not that kind of case. We didn't have any scientific evidence at all that exonerated Glenford. The new information we have is purely testimonial. That is, it would require a jury to believe somebody's testimony. Because a jury could just as easily take a different position than I did and say, well, I've heard the new information, doesn't change my mind. But you see, I didn't have that luxury because 30 years had gone by, so I had to predict what a jury 30 years ago would have done if they had heard the information I have 30 years later. And that's no easy task. But what you do is you learn as much as you can about the case, and you try to put yourself in that jury's mind, and you say, if I had heard this, could this have changed my verdict? Yes. And I came to a very clear conclusion, yes, that jury should have heard this. But because they didn't have the opportunity to hear this, we have to let the man go because it's been too long. And we can't do this over. We can't do a makeover with this. So this, in a sense, Glenford's case is very unusual. What you usually have is you usually have a DNA type of case where a man is convicted of raping a woman, and then somebody discovers a DNA swab of material that was never tested, and it gets tested. Turns out the man didn't do it, and then that's scientific, that's gold standard. You don't even have to go to the second phase, you just say he's out. And see, that wasn't the case here. We had to make a lot of decisions, one of which was, is our source of information credible? Would it affect the jury? Because let's just say my information was, I killed Isidore Roseman because God sent me to do it. And I've been flying around the universe for the last 30 years waiting to land. Well, you can quickly see that may not be the most credible information in the world. But we determined that it was credible, and that's what we had to do. Now, in terms of your question, what would I do if I won the position with respect to law enforcement? The thing I would do is I would, as I said earlier, maintain a continuing dialogue with our law enforcement officers on every case, and so that the lead detectives in every case would know not only today or tomorrow, but 2 years from now. If we come across something that leads us to think that the guy we convicted 2 years ago didn't do it, they have to turn that over to me. And if they don't turn that over to me, then more than likely, if I knew they knew about it and concealed it, I'd indict them for obstruction of justice. And so that would be the hammer with the carrot. If you don't do this, I will put you in jail for not doing it. And, yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, one question, thank you. Thank you for being here. My question is that what is being set up now to avoid what happened to Glenn Ford and others to come? What system is in place now? And my second question to you is, you in part answered it, but my second question to you is that the law enforcement that turned the information over to you guys, this information, do anybody have any idea how long law enforcement hold this information, and why is there not anybody that's going to be indicted, or is there somebody that's going to be indicted for holding this information, and how soon did they have this information and didn't turn this information over to the prosecutor's office that you all can look at it and make a determination? Part of the National Baptist Association meets a pastors met the other week ago, and this was one of the questions that they asked at our roundtable, because we approximately have 3 million members. So they was asking that question the other day when we met. They was like, okay, ask the DA, or those who come that are seeking the office of DA, ask them that simple question: why is it that if law enforcement hold this information, or how soon did they get this information? Why did they turn this information over to those guys back then, if they had it back then? And why are they not being prosecuted? Because we do know Glenn Ford cannot speak for himself.
Well, that is an excellent question. In fact, all these national reporters that are supposed to be so smart
Yes, sir.
never ask that question. In committee, that is the most, that's the smartest question I've heard about this whole matter, and I'll answer it for you. The particular law enforcement officer that brought this information to my attention was not even in law enforcement when the Isidore Roseman murder happened. He was in high school. So he had no knowledge of the Isidore Roseman homicide. Now that's part of the problem with things being 30 years old. You know, all us older guys, we remember, and it was really fortuitous that I was old as I am, because I wouldn't have known about it if I'd have been as young as this law enforcement officer. It would have went right over my head. So that's the reason no one's been indicted, because the law enforcement officer was so young. He heard this information, but he didn't know who Isidore Roseman was, and he wasn't interested in Isidore Roseman's case. He was interested on cases he was working on. And so in the course of working on those cases, he said to me, I'd like you to come take a statement from one of my sources to see if one of my sources is on the up and up. So I go take a video recorded statement of this source, because I also am looking for people who have committed other murders. Not the Roseman murder, but some other murders. You know, Roseman's not even on my radar when I'm asking these questions. And this source starts to answer my questions, and he's giving me all the information. It's good information, and I'm writing it down and writing it down and writing it down. And he's telling me things about these other homicides, and it's really good information. And then nonchalantly, and just as an aside, it's not even an answer to a question, he says, and oh yeah, they killed the old jeweler man on Stoner Avenue too. Wow. He didn't even call him by name. He said the old jeweler man. Wow. Now, if you hadn't been in Shreveport as an adult in 1983, you wouldn't know what the hell he was talking about. Old jeweler man on Stoner Avenue. Wow. Well, I knew what he was talking about, because 1983, I had just left the DA's office, and the Roseman homicide was the first one that occurred after I left. I would have had the Roseman case had I not left when I left. So I said, what did you just say? He said, you know, the old jeweler man on Stoner. I said, where on Stoner? He said, you know, they're sitting there across from the graveyard. Wow. Well, immediately, I knew he was talking about the Isidore Roseman murder. Because Mr. Roseman, although he was 56, back in those days, they considered you an old man. He also sold and fixed jewelry. He repaired watches, and he sold china, and he sold jewelry. And so when the source of information said that, I said, well, then you and I are going to need to talk. And it started from there. But the law enforcement officer who presented that source of information to me, he still didn't know what I was talking about when I said, you know what he just said? He said, no, I don't know anything about it. What about our cases? I said, no, this is very, very important. So, in a sense, it was fortuitous. And that's why I say one of the best ways to avoid this is if you make it crystal clear on the front end with your detectives and your law enforcement people that just because we've had a trial and a conviction, don't think this is necessarily over. You know, as George Gershwin said, it ain't necessarily so. Because things do change. You do get new information. In Glenn Ford's case, you get it 30 years later. In another case, you may get it 6 months later or 2 years later. But the only way I'm going to know about that is if I've got ears and eyes on the ground in the form of law enforcement people who go, better turn that into the DA. And they'll go, oh, that's just, no, turn it in.
Just a quick follow-up. Who do you think let Glenn Ford down? I mean, because I heard you say that. Who do you think out of the different law enforcement agencies and we know that the system itself is not perfect, but who do you think directly, because I asked the others that call me, this coming forth to the district attorney, who do you think let Glenn Ford down back then? Can you just from you personally, who do you think let Glenn Ford down? Because it's always somebody to blame. But who would you say, who actually let this man down?
Well, and I respectfully disagree with the premise of your question. I don't think there's necessarily always someone to blame.
Okay.
You know, it would be very easy for me to stand up here and say, well, that was the DA's fault in 1983. He should have known that Glenn Ford didn't do it. But that's not true. And it's Mr. Stroud that we're talking about, and he's the one that feels so badly now.
Right.
And I think Mr. Stroud, and of course this is just my opinion, I think he's taken on more guilt than he should. He made a charging decision at the time based on the information that he had at the time. And you have to remember, not only was it Mr. Stroud's thought, but 12 jurors unanimously thought Glenn Ford did it. The Louisiana Supreme Court, with one dissent, thought Glenn Ford did it. And every judge who's heard his appeal for the last 30 years thought Glenn Ford did it. So it's not like this was an aberration. We've had a lot of bright legal minds look at this for 30 years and they all checked off on it. So I don't think in that sense anyone in particular failed Glenn Ford. I think that something that may have helped avoid this is this committee of lawyers that I was talking to you about. And I don't know who reviewed the case and how well it was reviewed, and that's not my purpose to be critical of that. But if you had 6 lawyers, just like if you had 6 seasoned pastors, and you had a difficult ethical issue to deal with in your church community, one pastor may say, no, this is it. This is what we're going to do. I don't care what you're saying over here. This is it. It would be better for 6 pastors to consider that ethical issue from their very different perspectives. Because while one may have tunnel vision, the others may not. And this has happened to me in my professional career so many times, I'm embarrassed to say. I'll go, no, this is it. I know this is it. I know this is it. I know this is right. And then somebody says, but you're wrong, and here's why you're wrong. And I go, you're right. I mean, it's comical now, but you see the point. The more experience you can bring to bear on a difficult issue, the more likely you are to have a better outcome. The man from 60 Minutes, and boy, he chewed my rear for about all 60 minutes. And he was on me like bee on honey, man, right from the get-go, about, you know, why I'm no good, and why we're no good, and why all this happened. And I finally said to him, I said, sir, what you want is perfection. And on this earth, there is no perfection. All you can do is do the best you can to ensure that you have a system in place whom, if it is manned by good people, you're going to have a better chance of having a good outcome. But when you think about it, in what other endeavor of life is it perfect? Well, we shouldn't have sent the guys on the space shuttle because the O-rings were going to freeze up. Well, no one knew the O-rings were going to freeze up. Does that mean we don't ever go into space? We can't operate because no one's ever operated to take the tumor out like that. So let's let the patient die. Because we're afraid if we don't take the tumor out this new way, you know, we could get sued, things could go bad. Well, things do go bad. And it doesn't necessarily mean that any particular person is at fault. And now, I'll distinguish this case from the cases where police officers plant evidence and are dirty cops. And we're not talking about that kind of deal. That deal's always been around. And about the only thing you can do is catch the dirty cops and indict them for the jail. Yes, I'm sorry. Hope that answered your question.
I want to change gears a bit.
Yes, sir.
I certainly understand the aggressive prosecution of first-degree murder.
Yes, sir.
In political corruption, abuse, malfeasance cases,
Yes, sir.
the Caddo DA's office recently has had a response that many of those cases are not being prosecuted. Use, for example, the sheriff's investigation, which the U.S. Attorney pursued. Wasn't that first handed to the Caddo DA and no prosecution was pursued?
You're talking about the case of
Michael Williams.
I believe it was first handed to the Caddo DA's office, Mr. Marks, and it's my recollection that we did not bring any charges, and I think the matter was then transferred to the U.S. Attorney's office, and they did seek and secure an indictment.
Haven't there been other cases brought where evidence was brought to the Caddo DA where the decision was we're not going to look at it?
Well, in the absence of you telling me a specific case, I don't recall any like that. I can tell you this, that I have very aggressively gone after the fire department and the fire chief for that scandal that happened out at Station 8. And not only the firemen who were involved with abusing those mentally retarded people, but also the then fire chief for covering it up. And we have that case coming for trial very soon in October. And that is a case of governmental malfeasance. We also have a grand jury that's meeting in 2 weeks to finish up that inquiry into governmental malfeasance. So I know that in those cases we've been very aggressive in dealing with governmental malfeasance. You know, part of that problem, I think, Mr. Marks, is over the course of time, the state DAs have deferred to the federal government on prosecution of elected officials and administrators and governmental officials. I think that's a mistake on the part of state prosecutors. I think that we should handle our own laundry in-house. I know that Judge Michael Walker was indicted by the feds and convicted by the feds for taking bribes. I always thought, and I still think, that's something we should have done. He worked 2 floors below my floor and took bribes for 3 years. And you telling me the feds have to come across the street and do my work for me? So I disagree with that policy of deferring to the federal government. You know, they make mistakes too, and they don't go after people too. You know, dude will tell you, it's an old prosecutor's joke that unless you give a U.S. attorney a video confession, a DNA match, a fingerprint match, and 6 eyewitnesses, they won't touch the case because they think it's not prosecutable. And dude will tell you know, in other words, they will not go to trial unless they're absolutely assured there's no way they can lose, and then they lose. That's the nature of the trial business. So I hope that answers your question. I can't respond to things in the abstract. If you give me a particular case, I'll find out. Yes.
In recent, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, one more, we have to wrap it.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So, in recent days since the shooting in South Carolina, across the country, we've seen a lot of local governments readdress emblems of the Confederacy, the flag, especially in government property. And so my question to you is, do you believe that the Confederate monument on the steps of the Caddo Parish Courthouse should be taken down?
Very good question.
I'm sorry.
It's a very good question. It is very good.
Yeah, I'm related to this.
It's a very good question.
That's a very good question. I think, let me answer it in this way. I was not parenthetically involved, but I was a close observer of the Felton Dorsey case. Mr. Dorsey was a man who broke into an elderly woman's home in Greenwood and murdered her son in front of her, and then burned everybody up. He was tried in Caddo Parish at a time when the Confederate flag was flying over that monument. He was an African American. He was convicted of that murder and he was sentenced to death. And one of the issues in his case was the jury intimidated, specifically were the African American jurors intimidated by the fact that that Confederate flag was hanging over the courthouse? My answer to that was no. And I'll tell you why. Because it was something the defense lawyers used to try to get Mr. Dorsey off. And the reason I say that is they never asked a single juror about the Confederate flag. Never one. When they were picking the jury. Like, does that flag bother you? And it's like most things. People have been coming into that courthouse for so long. I didn't even know that was a Confederate memorial until somebody told me one day, did you ever read that? I said, no, I don't read it. I just go into work every day. And that's what most people do that go in and out of the courthouse. So I don't think it affects criminal justice because I think people are smart enough and sensitive enough and good, decent, honest people are going to decide cases on the facts and the law. They're not going to decide cases on what's hanging outside the building. But having said that, as with the case in Charleston, I think it would be appropriate to remove the memorial. And the reason I think it would be appropriate to remove the memorial is because it is it becomes a distraction to the more fundamental issues. In other words, I got no problem if you have nothing out there. Just have a concrete slab. That's fine by me, because it's not going to change what goes on in that building. To me, the problem is not the existence of the monument. The problem is why we have people killing 6-month-old babies. That's the problem. But no, I think it would be perfectly appropriate to remove the Confederate memorial. A lot of people say a lot of things about it, but the Confederacy represented slavery. And I mean, anybody who tells you it didn't is lying through their teeth. So why not just do away with it? And let's begin the real discussion. Why are people killing each other like they're killing each other in our community? It doesn't have anything to do with the flag or the monument. It has to do with people. And I think if we can get beyond things that distract us from the real work, we'll be better off for it. So, yeah, tear it down, blow it up, move it, I don't care.